what we're going to cover, what I want to try to cover, is the books of First, Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and First and Second Chronicles. That seems like a lot, and it really is. But again, the base of what we're trying to do is get to the point where we understand the kind of methodology of what they're writing, the stories, and what those books are trying to cover. So last week, if you remember, we went through. We talked about Judges. We talked about Ruth, right? And the understanding that Ruth was actually during the time of the Judges. So we kind of understand that in the book of Joshua as well. And this move, right? So we had Genesis, the beginning, the origin story. We had the remainder of the Pentateuch or the Torah, which was Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. End of Deuteronomy, Moses dies. Joshua, the book of Joshua, is named after the leader Joshua. Joshua, who takes them into the promised land. They get in the promised land. They divide the land up, and we saw those maps last week. They divide the land up between the 12 tribes of Israel. They get settled, and it doesn't take very long, and they forget who God is and forget what God has done. And we saw this cycle, right? That the Israelites got comfortable. They forgot about God. They started to worship other gods. God allowed other nations to come in, cause havoc, and then he would raise up a judge. The judge would come in, turn the people's hearts back, kind of really as a military leader, fight back the enemy, turn the people's hearts back to God. They would have prosperity for a season, and then the cycle would kind of go over. And then we ended with Judges, this idea that they had no king. That's what the end of Judges says, is that there wasn't a king in Israel, and all the people did as they saw fit, right? And so that was kind of the story of Joshua, Judges, and again Ruth in there. So we're going to pick up from that point in the first book, which is First Samuel. Again, there's First, Second Samuel, First, Second Kings, and First and Second Chronicles. So the period of Judges, if we kind of try to grasp how long things were taking, right? So if we remember, the people were in Egypt for about 400 years, roughly, right? It takes them about 40 years to get to the promised land. They get settled in the promised land. And then roughly about 300 years, plus or minus some years, is the period of the book of Judges. Okay. And so in that period, again, they've got this ebb and flow, this things are going great, and then things go bad. Things go great, things go bad for about 300 plus years, right? Of them in the promised land. Okay. And then, like I said, Judges 21-25, very last verse, the very last chapter of the book of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So then we turn, and the next page, or the next book, again, is First Samuel. And First Samuel is actually the continuation of Judges. What a lot of people don't understand is that, again, Judges is not about a legal piece, but really about a ruler in the essence of the fact of taking the people from one point to another. Again, kind of a military. Moses, we see a lot of times we don't think of him as a military man, but there was a lot of fighting that they actually had to do. There were some things they had to do. Joshua was also considered a judge, and Samuel, who we're going to find out about in a moment, was also a judge. That time period, then the whole of the Judges is for about roughly 400 years as well. You kind of see a theme within the Bible of about 400 years as they take the genealogy and they're able to date back. And so there's these 400-year cycles that end up happening. And again, so when we talk about the book of Judges, we're talking about a 300-year period after they get to the promised land. But the what we would call the journey of the Judges actually started from Moses and ends with Samuel. And it ends with Samuel because they anoint their first king, and the king is Saul. And that's where we get within the book of First Samuel, is this transformation. Okay. So Samuel starts out, a very interesting story. I was sharing with a couple people just a little bit before we started, and um, the first, second Samuel, first, second Kings, first, second Chronicles is a crazy, amazing stories. There's so much stuff going on. There's wars and murders, love stories, deceit, just there's a Goliath. I mean, there are all these cool things that happen within the pages, and it starts out right at the beginning with a barren woman. The woman's Hannah, and she's downtrodden. She doesn't have any children. She wants a child. Goes and prays, and the priest at that point, Eli, is a bad priest. He's actually a bad father. His two sons are known for taking portions of meat that weren't right, and doing the sacrifices incorrectly. And so he's known as a bad priest, as a bad father. He's actually considered a fat man as well, because a gluttony, right? He's been eating way too much of the sacrifices, and so that's what he's known for. And a young boy. So within the first 3 chapters, you have this amazing story. Hannah shows up. She's praying. Eli thinks, well, she's drunk, and they have this exchange. And she says, "No, I'm drunk. I'm not drunk. It's too early in the morning. I haven't drank. I haven't eaten. I just want a child. But if God will bless me with a child, I promise to commit the child to the Lord." And that's what happens. She conceives the boy Samuel. Samuel then is given over, taken to Eli, and given to Eli to care for and to raise up. Okay. And so obviously you get right away, then the book of Samuel is named after this boy who begins a transformation of the Israelites. So what we could almost do, if you read Judges and just went right into First Samuel and didn't think that there was a change in books, you would feel like you're in the book of Judges still, because it reads very similar to it. It's a story form, right? It's talking about what the sin of the nation, in this case, really focusing on the sin of Eli and his sons, and what's going on in that environment. But God begins to raise up someone. And in this case, again, very similar to the Samson story. If you've read the Samson story, they knew from a young age that he was going to be something special. Samuel as well was going to be something special. And we hear about the Lord. This is the story where, right, the Lord is calling out, and it says in the first part of First Samuel that people had not heard the voice of God. And Samuel hears God speaking, doesn't know it's God. He thinks it's Eli. He goes to Eli multiple times. By the third time, Eli's like, "Hey," when he says, just say, "Speak, Lord. Your servant is listening." That's that whole story. And so Samuel becomes an amazing individual at a very young age, and is known as someone that's going to do something, and is told by God at a young age, by the way, you're going to take over for Eli. And he doesn't want to tell Eli the story. So just imagine that's the start of First Samuel, and that's really the start of this series, the First, Second Samuel, First, Second Kings, First, Second Chronicles. Right, that's how it kicks off the whole thing. Is, again, it's kind of a major plot twist. God is on the move. He's going to do something special, and so as we see that, one of the things that we end up finding out is that in this time frame, again, Eli's a bad priest. He's a bad parent. His two sons, no good, right? He reprimands them, sort of, kind of. There's a section in there he says he talks to them, but he doesn't do anything. He's like that parent that says, "Hey, if I count to 3, you're going to be in trouble," and they never get to 3. That's Eli, right? He keeps getting to 2 3/4, but can't get to 3 to say anything. And God tells him, "Hey, this is what's going to happen. You have not done what you're supposed to be doing. Your boys have not done what you're supposed to be doing, right? I'm going to take the high priest, out of your lineage." Okay. So what does that mean? Now, so if you look at the genealogy here of the priests, so you have Aaron. Okay, so Moses' brother, Aaron was the high priest, and from Aaron, then he had Ithamar, and there were several there, right? And then, obviously, 300 plus years later, you have Eli. Okay, so and Eli has two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. These are the two bad boys, right? Samuel enters the picture after the boys, so he's younger than the boys, right? He enters the picture, and God begins to move at that point. And on the same day, another incredible story within the Philistines attack. They utilize the Ark of the Covenant. They think it's a weapon. They don't seek God's guidance, but they bring the Ark of the Covenant out. The Philistines actually attack even harder because they're like, oh, the God has entered the camp or entered the war zone, so we need to even fight harder. They destroy the Israelites. They kill Phinehas and Hophni, who have brought the ark out, and they capture the ark. A runner goes back and tells Eli, who's sitting down, he's 90 some odd years old, if I remember right. He's very, very fat. And it's the Bible, by the way. That's not Pastor James' words. He's fat. He's a fat man, fat old guy, right? He hears about it. He falls back in his chair, breaks his neck, and he dies. So in one day, the line of Eli, the priest, are killed, right? Samuel then begins to take over, not the high priest title, because you'll notice that there's others afterwards that follow, but we'll see a change later on. But he ends up taking over, and you see in the stories that we no longer talk about like Ahitob or Ichabod, right? We don't talk about those that came from the line of Eli, the line of Aaron, as the high priest or doing the high priestly duties, because a high priest, when we get into the story of Saul, should have been the one that's anointing Saul as king, but it's Samuel. Samuel also anoints David, right? So he takes over the high priestly duties, but he does not take over the title of the high priest. Okay, and so that's kind of the beginning of First Samuel. And so we have, again, there's all these really incredible stories that are happening. You're gonna have the story of David and Goliath in there. You're gonna have all these different things that happen within this story. But again, major plot points when you think about it: Samuel raised up, Aaron, now through Eli, loses through Ithamar, his son, right, and then loses all the way down to Eli, loses that natural line that was supposed to be the high priest. They begin to lose that. They don't lose the title right away, but they begin to lose again their part, right, to play. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So then, as the story goes on, we'll follow the priest, and it's important because again, when we look through the Bible, we're always paying attention, or should be paying attention, to how does Jesus fit into all of this. Okay. Well, Jesus, we know, is our high priest, right? So if we kind of know the prophecies, what's going on, everything is based off of that. So we're looking back and trying to figure out. So here, what we've got is then, if we kind of follow the timeline here, that David, Saul is anointed as king, right? He becomes a king. He leads roughly 40 years. Okay, so he leads 40 years. He dies. David takes over, and he leads 40 years. Right. Solomon takes over. In Solomon's reign, a major shift happens. Abiathar, as you can see on the right there, if you follow the Eli line, Abiathar is the high priest, but Solomon, for the first time ever, disposes of the priest, the high priest, and anoints Zadok as the high priest, removing Eli's high priest from then on. Even with Jonathan, the son of Abathar, never becomes high priest in the essence of the high priest of Israel. What we know of the 12 tribes of Israel, right? So what we see is this prophecy that was spoke to Eli gets fulfilled um, all the way down when Solomon. So you've got Samuel, who's the last judge, anoints Saul as the first king. Saul dies, David takes over, he's the second king. David dies, Solomon takes over, the third king. By that point, that's when the transformation happens, and this move from again from the line of really Eli to the line of Phineas, and not Eli's son Phineas, but the other Phineas, right? Going back to the other side, the Eleazar line. Okay, and that happens actually again in First Kings 22, as you can kind of see that going through. So why is all that important? Because the again, when we talk about like the genealogies and the tribes, it's really important to remember who is who, right? And where do they come from, and everything is based off your line. If you read through the book of Numbers, for example, you find a lot about the Levites, and again Aaron's line, right? The Levites and their roles. Okay, certain individuals, certain tribe within the Levites family line, they're tasked with carrying the holy things. They're not even given any carts because they have to carry them on their shoulders. That's their job. Another line is given a bunch of carts, but they can't touch the holy stuff, right? They can only touch the other things that need, right? So there's all these things based on your family line. And so if you kind of imagine Eli, his whole family had been the high priest going all the way back to Aaron. But because of Eli's sin and the sin of his sons, parents pay attention, the sin of his sons, they were removed from generations were removed. They were, obviously the three of them were killed in one day, but then only a short couple generations later, they were removed from the high priestly duty and would never regain that high priestly duty, right? So that's kind of one of the major storylines within from First Samuel all the way through the Chronicles, the Second Chronicles, as we kind of go through of what's going on. So it's not just about the kings; it's also about the priests, and it makes a big difference because we talked about, like on Sunday, we talked about the king Solomon, and he rode in right on the mule, right? And who the priest was that was anointing him. Well, that's what Abiathar was with Absalom, which was the man who was trying to take over the kingdom, and Zadok was with Solomon. So you kind of see this storyline, and there are positioning there of saying, okay, who's really God's anointed. So any questions before I move on? We're going to talk next kind of just about how do I read First Samuel through Second Chronicles, and we're going to dive into the nations a little bit. But any questions before I move on? Okay. So First Samuel through Second Chronicles. When we look at First Samuel, again, what we're looking at is the birth of Samuel, and it leads all the way to the death of Saul. Okay. Now there's a lot in between. There's a lot of movement because, again, it's not just the birth of Samuel, but it's the life of Samuel as he's growing up, the anointing. Eli and his sons are killed, right? There's fighting, there's things that are going on. Samuel's going about. He anoints Saul. Saul is king, the first king. God tells Samuel, hey, don't take this as a rejection on you. The people are actually rejecting me. How horrible would that be for God to just tell us that, right? They're rejecting me. So that you get all of Saul's life, his kingship, that 40 years are in the first book of First Samuel. So if you kind of think of Samuel's life, Saul's life, all within that first book, a lot of chapters, but a lot of exciting things to read about. Second Samuel comes on the scene. And again, we've had some of David already. Well, now we see David in a different light. Now we see David become the king. And he does this. He unifies the tribes. Okay. Now, why is that important? We talked about last week that when the Israelites went into the promised land, remember they moved and um, they all had their own tribes, right? And location, and they were set up. And I'll re-show the map because that'll help in a minute, but just kind of get that. But we talked about this concept that as they set up this area and they drifted apart. You know, here they're going through the desert for 40 years. They've been together for 40 years. You know, they're more kind of, you know, let me say more of a family, you know, in concept, this nation, but now this nation is separated. There's even some that are on the east side of the Jordan and the west side of the Jordan, you know, so geographically they've dispersed. And so when Saul becomes a king, and in fact, we can even look at the judges and see the same concept. When Saul becomes a king, he's not recognized by all 12 tribes as the king of Israel. Okay. He's recognized by his tribe and some others, but he's not recognized by the 12 to all 12 tribes. So David shows up on the scene, and David has done some incredible things, one of which is almost completely eradicating um, the Philistines. Okay. And so David shows on the scene, and he takes over the kingship, Judah and Benjamin. He takes over the kingship. And then he's able to unify the other 10 tribes. So all 12 tribes actually, for the first time, unify under a leader. And what I mean by the first time, really the first time since Joshua, we see that the nation comes together. So you got 300 plus years plus the Samuel reign. And even under Samuel, the nations were not as unified as they were under Joshua. So you got a long time period. And finally, David shows up on the scene and he unifies the nation, right? So finally, Israel becomes Israel again. They have one king. And there's no more fighting. By the way, that's what you'll read. You're going to read some things, you know, about tribe, fighting tribe, you know, and First Samuel, like what in the world are they doing? You know, what is going on? So you have that scenario going on, and then at the end of Second Samuel, it's a really interesting story. And David numbers the military. He numbers the people, the fighting men. God did not want him to do this. A curse ends up coming upon the nation because of what he's done. And that's how Second Samuel ends. It's kind of like it's just a weird ending because it's not the death of David, although he was old at this point. You know, it's not the start of Solomon's life. You know, it's none of that stuff is going on. It just happens to be that Second Samuel ends with that curse, right? Again, it brought on by the sin of David doing what he should not have done. And then so First King opens up, right? And this is where we see David dying. So David dies, Solomon becomes king. He lives his life, right? He does this thing. He builds a temple, all that stuff, right? And then Rehoboam shows up. Now Rehoboam is Solomon's son. Okay, Rehoboam. So under David and Solomon, the tribes are united, right? There's one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. David and Solomon. Solomon dies. Rehoboam, his son, takes over. And because he listens to and this is in the story when you read it, because he listens to his friends instead of the elders, he actually drives a wedge, and what becomes known as the northern tribe, or the tribe of Israel, and this is where this becomes really important to remember this, and and I'll show a map and it'll help understand this. But Rehoboam divides the kingdom. So the 10 tribes of the north and the 2 tribes of the south. And that becomes for eternity, basically, from that moment. So for two kings and 2 kings only, they had a united kingdom. And then Solomon's son comes along, drives everything out. And then the rest of First Kings, we see the others, the from Rehoboam and Jeroboam, which is another king. They separate, the tribes separate, and then we begin to see and hear all these other stories of all these other kings. We're introduced to like Elijah the prophet and King Ahab and Jezebel, right? Queen Jezebel. Those are all in this time frame of the First Kings. Second Kings, well, I just totally did. I miss Second Kings? Second Kings comes along. I don't have a slide for it. I don't know how I forgot it. Is it somewhere up here? Okay. Second Kings comes along wherever I'm at. I don't have a slide for it. Sorry. Second Kings comes along, right, and continues that. It continues the story from King Ahab all the way to the capture, the captivity of both of Israel and then of Judah. Okay. First Chronicle now, this is where it gets really confusing, because you could almost read first and second Samuel, first and second Kings in order and be good to go. Like, okay, I'm golden. Then you get into first and second Chronicles. And First Chronicles actually starts out with the genealogy of Israel. And I think, Stacy, we kind of talked about this. It's a great place. And this is how they're able to figure out. They have the genealogy, and they actually in the by the 9th chapter. So the first 9 chapters are genealogy. They actually have the genealogy of those that were taken captive by Babylon and returned. And so they were able to tell, hey, are these pure Jewish individuals or are they some sort of mix, right? And so that's how we're able to get so much of our time frame and know the timing of everything and how old things are, right? Are in the first book of Chronicles. And so you can even tell by the name what it is. It's they say the writers, they refer to him as the chronicler, like a historian. That's what his job was to do. Chapter 10 comes along and Saul dies. Okay, so Saul died in what? First Samuel. Okay, so what we have here is we have an overlap of stories. So as we read, if you want to think about it, and this is how we read these, you can read these better. First, Second Kings, First, Second Samuel, First, Second Kings. Okay, chronological order, really good. Chronicles comes up and actually places itself at near the end of First Samuel, and it begins to continue to tell the story. Very similar to how you think about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're all telling the same story in different time frame and looking at different things, right? But it's all happening at the same time. The triumphal entry in Luke 19 is the same as I think it's Mark or Matthew 22 and Mark. I can't remember, Mark 11, Mark 12, wherever it's at, right? So it's still the same triumphal entry. So obviously Saul dying in First Chronicles chapter 10 is the same as him dying in First Samuel chapter 25, I think, right? Wherever he dies in that. And then it goes on, and then we see in First Chronicles it ends, Solomon anointed King David dies. So in the First Chronicles, we have the story from Saul's death all the way through to David's death and Solomon. Okay, parallel story to First Samuel, Second Samuel, right? Second Chronicles comes in, and Solomon takes over as king. This is we learn a lot about his prayer for wisdom, right? And building the temple. And then we see, and it follows the decline of Judah and the capture of Judah. Okay. All right. That's a lot in there. So I hope I haven't lost anybody. Now what I want to do is kind of walk you through what this will look like from both a map and a timeline, and maybe it'll help bring some clarification into the thing. So if you kind of just pay attention to the red box, there's a lot of information there. You can see obviously from the start, but if you look at the red box, it talks about the United Kingdom and the divided kingdom. Okay, you'll see there's a line there about Israel, the northern country, and Judah, the southern country. Okay, so when they become united under David, they again they're one nation. They're the nation of Israel. Solomon comes along, nation of Israel. Solomon's son Rehoboam comes along, acts a fool, and the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes say, nope, you're not our king. Jeroboam is our king. And they go and they say, nope, we're separating. And so Judah, the nation of Judah, is formed. The nation of Judah is actually made up of two tribes: the tribe of Judah, makes sense, and the tribe of Benjamin. Okay. And then you can see, if you kind of look down a little bit below, what you see here is First Samuel, and here's the First Chronicles. First and Second Samuel is covered. The time frame is covered also within First Chronicles. Right? Does that make sense? You kind of see down here how this works. First and Second Kings, then Second Chronicles is around the same time frame. I know quite a few individuals who've read and said, "Wait, I've heard this story before." Well, yeah, if you read First Samuel, now you're reading First Chronicles, you probably heard the story before, right? And so they have a lot of the same stories. And just like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, like the chronicler spends a little bit more time talking about the prayer of Solomon, the setting up of the temple of Solomon. He spends a lot more time in that area where Samuel does not, right? And then you also see that in that same time period, the book of Psalms was written. Well, who wrote Psalms? David wrote the majority of them. Solomon wrote quite a few of them. And then there's several others that wrote just some here and there. But the majority of the book of Psalms is written in that time period of First, Second Samuel, from basically again the birth of Samuel to Solomon, right? Proverbs, Solomon's book, right, was written by him. Song of Solomon, same thing. Ecclesiastes, another Solomon book, right? So when you look at those were all written in that time frame. Get into First Kings, Second Kings, you have again the split that happens, right? Because Rehoboam takes over and does his stuff, and then you have Jonah, Amos, Hosea are all kind of in that point. They're all northern tribes. You see the Israel there, right? And then Judah. For Judah, you got Obadiah, Joel, Micah, Isaiah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and Jeremiah. All these prophets, both major and minor prophets, were in that same time period. So as we're reading, and that's what we're going to get to next week, are the prophets. I believe I got the prophets for next week. No, I've got poetry. We're going to end with prophets. But you'll see a lot of the stories and a lot of the prophecies that happen that we read about in the end of the Old Testament. If we really wanted to read them correctly, we would read them at the same time as we're reading the Chronicles or we're reading First and Second Kings, right? If we wanted to understand Joel better, we read it in conjunction with what is happening within the nation of Judah within the time frame of Chronicles. I'm going to pause there because I want to just make sure that you guys are kind of getting what we're talking about now, because there's a major shift in the Second Chronicles, First Kings, Second Kings, from again a one united, or what we called Israel this whole time, now to a northern and southern tribe.
Pastor, I want to go back to what you said earlier. What was the purpose of the census that David was taking?
Yeah, so David, when he took the census, it was about figuring out how mighty he was, how mighty, how great of a nation that we've come, how important we are, right? God had asked Moses before to do a census. I believe Joshua also took a census that God was asked for, had asked for. This time, it's the intent that God is displeased with, because it's David has now had rest. Right? They've conquered the Philistines. They've conquered the lands around them. They've got they've got peace. One of the first times in so many years, and it's really about look at how mighty we are. And so the idea of the census was exactly that. I'm going to show everybody how big and bad Israel now is, and we're going to prove to the nations around us that you can't mess with us, because we're big, and our armies are so amazing. We've got so many individuals that that we could take anything on. So he says this, go number Israel and Judah. So the king said to Joab, the commander of his army, this is David, he said, go through all the tribes and number the people, that I may know the number of the people. But the heart of the whole thing, again, when they numbered, you'll notice Numbers talks about it too, the book of Numbers, that they numbered specific individuals. They never really numbered the children. They numbered individuals from 20 to 60, I think it was, the fighting age, the age that they could do things, right? And again, men. So when you get down to the end, and this is in 2 Samuel chapter 24, this is, and Joab gave the sum of the numbering of the people in Israel. There were 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000. Right. So what? 1.3 million, 1.3 million valiant men with the sword is basically what David wanted to know. How many guys have we got fighting?
He wants to know how Frank got a white hair.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, you did.
Okay. Frank, did you have a question, or Debbie? I keep seeing a hand.
It's my hand, but it's Frank who has a question.
The 12 tribes. I want to know when and where.
That's so loud.
When and where did they decided to take a rabbi as the leader of the Jewish faith? When and what time did they change and come one tribe? They left 12, left there with 12. When did they decide we're going to take one person, that's a rabbi, and that's who we're going to go to for information?
Well, actually, if you look at Moses was the first one to combine anyone, right? And so he was considered, and I know you guys missed the beginning, but he was really considered one of the judges. He was the first judge. And so they never really looked at it from a rabbi standpoint. And then Solomon, who becomes the last judge. So you got Moses, Joshua, the second judge. Then you have a bunch of other judges in the book of Judges. Then you have Samuel, who comes, and he's the last judge. Samuel anoints Saul, and that's the end of the age of judges, because judges were military leaders in essence. If you want to, because again, the leader is God. And what God tells Samuel when the people cry out for a king, he said, Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me as their king. So God was considered the king of Israel until Saul was anointed king, because that's what the people wanted.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Right. And so again, that you got this major shift again from God is the king. Not that they treated him like that, but God is the king. And in fact, if you read, and I challenge you to read the beginning of 1 Samuel, because you'll see this exchange between Samuel and God, and Samuel and the people. Excuse me, because Samuel will tell the people, hey, if you anoint a king, your sons and your daughters are going to be taken by him. You have to pay taxes to him. You can do all these things you've never had to do before. And they're like, but we just want to be like the nations around us. How stupid. I mean, there's no other way to say it. That they're like, we just want to be like everyone else, when God has said, don't be like everyone else. And if you're not like everyone else, I'm going to bless you. But they make a decision saying, we just want to be like everyone else. We want a king. And we could care less that if he's going to take our sons to war, and if he's going to, you know, take our daughters and make them servants, and he's going to take part of our property and our horses and all this stuff. We could care less. We just want to be like everybody else. That is a shame. And I won't. I was about ready to preach. I won't preach, but that's what happens in the beginning of 1 Samuel. And again, so Samuel comes in, anoints Saul. If we read the Saul story, Saul was not that good, right? And again, he did everything that Samuel told the nation he would do. Took the sons to war, took your daughters, you know, took your land, your horses, you know, everything, charged you taxes, the whole thing. David comes along and kind of redeems all that and actually becomes the first good king. For all the bad stuff that he does, he becomes the first good king. And then Solomon's time frame, or specifically in the early time of Solomon, they had, you know, the riches that were amazing beyond comparison, right? And it wasn't until the end when Solomon is known to have disobeyed God, and then again with his children Rehoboam, who separates those nations. But at that point, so you see this plot, this change from God's king. Hey, we don't want God to be our king anymore, and nor do we want the judge. We want a king all our own, right? And so they've got that, and that began the height and the lowest point, right? The best that the nation of Israel had ever been, and the lowest that they had ever been within these generations from 1 Samuel through 2 Chronicles. We see the height and the destruction of a nation. Okay. All right. I got a little bit more on this. I'm going to just dial in a bit. This is just a little bit better picture of that time frame to kind of get you an idea. Again, so if you can kind of hold this in, especially as we get into the prophets, you know, again, Obadiah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Amos, Jonah. You know the story of Jonah. Those are all within that same time period, and what was happening within 2 Chronicles, the end of 1 Kings, and into the 2 Kings, because again, they went from one nation under David and Solomon to the northern tribe and the southern tribe. And at that point, once they separated like that, they no longer had the military might, nor God's blessing to move forward and be able to fight the nations around them. So if we look, this is the genealogy of the kings then, right? So let's kind of look at this, because this is important to kind of understand. It helps us get a better glimpse of what actually happened from 1 Samuel all the way to 2 Chronicles. So on the top, you've got Saul. Saul's the first king. Ishbosheth becomes the actual second king of part of the tribes of Israel, right? But again, Judah and Benjamin say David's the king. He overthrows Ishbosheth. That's probably the best way to put it. And again, unites the kingdoms. So under David and Solomon, we see that they're anointed. Now there's Adonijah and Absalom. As you read some of the stories, you wonder, well, who are they? Sons of David, right? One actually overthrew his father for a short time, and his father actually leaves. King David leaves. He's an old man. He leaves Jerusalem. He leaves and actually finally comes back and takes back the kingship. The other one, again, is the one who's trying to Adonijah, right? Ajah is trying to overthrow Solomon, but Solomon gets anointed king. Solomon has Rehoboam, okay? And you'll notice that it's got kind of a color there. I don't know if you can see it, right? The blue means that they were a united nation, right? Uh, uh, and then green, Rehoboam, shows the split, red and green. Green becomes the what we know of as Judah. So Judah again is Judah and Benjamin, the southern kingdom, right? And then Israel, which are the 10 other tribes, right, becomes the northern, and Jeroboam becomes the king. Okay, so you can kind of follow, if you follow the right here, you've got Rehoboam and then Abijah, then Asa, then Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, and then all of a sudden there's just some crazy arrows going, like what is going on? He's disposed and this other guy's put in, and then that guy puts this other guy in, and then all this stuff begins to happen, because what ends up happening is in this time frame they're being overtaken by other nations, and so other nations are deciding who's going to be the king, right? Oh, well, no, it's this guy. No, now it's going to be this guy. Now it's going to be oh, well, he died, right? And then if we follow the left side, it's the same thing. Jeroboam, Nadab, right? Baasha, who was another son, right, of Jeroboam, right? You kind of see that. So the progression there. Elah, he died. Zimri, he died. Omri, okay, he's alive long enough and does evil, and that's kind of the mantra of the Chronicles, the mantra of the Kings. What you'll see is Elah did evil as his father had before him, and so he died, and he reigned 5 years, and Zimri did evil as his father Baasha had done as well, and he died and only reigned 5 years. So you have a lot of these short reigns because of the evil of the individual. And then now Ahab, which most people know the name Jezebel, you can't really take those two away. You've got Ahab, King Ahab, and Queen Jezebel, right? They are a force to be reckoned with. That's in the time of Elijah. If we know the Elijah story, Ahab was evil and Jezebel was eviler. I don't think that's a word, but it was not good, right? It was not a good pairing. Some crazy things happen. And again, you kind of follow the line there and what's going on. But they're a divided nation. That now you've got the northern tribe, who actually gets overthrown much faster than the southern tribe. The tribe of Judah and Benjamin were warriors. They were united, and they were believed, because remember the priests, that they had the true priest. Because the other line, the line of Eli that we had talked about, and I told you we were going to get back to it, the line of Eli went with the northern tribe, okay, and said, well, we're going to be the ones. The southern tribe has Jerusalem. The southern tribe has the temple, the only true a place or where God's presence is, as they would know, that's where you would sacrifice. They have it, the southern tribe. And so the southern tribe is blessed because they have the true priest, and they continue, even with the mistakes that they make, they continue on in the line of being good kings after God's heart. Not like their father David, which is what the first, second Kings Chronicles will tell you, but still much better than Ahab, right? They didn't go that far. And then so kind of remember where Ahab is. I went to the next one. So you can see there's a bunch more that come through, this whole line, to where finally at Hosea is the end of the northern tribe. It's the last king of the northern tribe. And then for the southern tribe, they last some generations later. They're able to withstand the attacks, but they're finally overthrown. Jerusalem is destroyed, and Jehoiachin is the last, technically. And you'll see kind of again what he's done is put it as like a puppet ruler at some point. That's why this line kind of goes. Zedekiah goes back right into the leadership. So if we look and remember from last week, this is the picture of the tribes. Okay, do we remember this? Right? So here are the 12 tribes. This is how they were set up. And you've got your Jordan River down the middle. You've got the east, which has Manasseh, or what they call the half tribe of Manasseh, Gad, Reuben, or the Reubenites, and then to the west, you've got everyone else. And so what's interesting, you've got Simeon here, right? He's kind of in the southern, okay? But we remember what I just said. The southern tribe becomes known as Judah and is made of Judah and Benjamin. During this time, during the reign of Rehoboam, Simeon, that tribe actually moves north. Right, so they actually become part of the northern tribe. Later on, we actually hear about some of them defecting and coming back down to the southern tribe and being assimilated into the nation of Judah. Okay, so as you read through, what you'll start reading, and it gets very, very confusing because the chronicler and the kings, they flip back and forth between, right? They'll flip back and forth between the two different nations, and you're reading about, Jeroboam, and then all of a sudden you're reading about Rehoboam, and you're like, oh wait, where am I? Right? So it's trying to remember, okay, this northern tribe, southern tribes, northern tribes, southern tribes, right? And again, a lot of ways you can tell is by the language that they're utilizing. Anytime they talk about Judah, they're always talking about the southern tribe. Israel now again is known as the northern tribe. They're also, you'll see a lot more that the northern tribe becomes the evil tribes, if the evil nation. Their kings are more evil than the southern, although they do bad things from time to time. And there's a lot of warring between the tribes, which is probably the worst thing that happened to the overall nation of Israel. They defeated themselves more than any other nation did, and they weakened themselves so much between Judah and Israel that that it allowed the other nations to come in and destroy them. You'll read stories about the nation of Israel contracting with Egypt to come in and war against Judah. I mean, that's just insanity to think about. That's where they started from, and they left, and now they're paying Egypt to come beat up their own people, right? Their own brothers. And so this is what the nation looks like after Rehoboam. Okay, so you've got Judah now. You'll see Jerusalem's the capital again. So Jerusalem is the place, right? It's where the temple's at. That's where the rightful priest is. That's where the Ark of the Covenant is. That's where everything happens, right? And so Judah becomes and envelops Simeon, right? And so again, he's moved up, and then Israel. You can kind of see how the green here. This is all of Israel. Okay, so the northern tribe and the southern tribe surrounded again by other nations that are there. Philistia, again, we know that's the land of the Philistines, the Philistines, right? They're conquered, but this is kind of what it looks like. And again, if you kind of remember, Africa's down here, right? So the Saudi Arabia Peninsula, and then into Africa. So you look at that and you see again, what you've got is now you've got Bethel and Dan. You'll notice those little houses, those are temples. So they actually set up two temples in the northern tribe of Israel. One very close to Jerusalem in Bethel, which is house of God. That's what it's called, the house of God. And again, Dan. Now God, when God had set things up, he had said, Jerusalem will be the temple, and no one is to worship anywhere else. No one is to sacrifice anywhere else. But again, because the southern tribe took over Jerusalem, that's their property. The northern tribe decides, well, we're going to set one up in Bethel, and their property went so far north, they thought, well, we don't want to go all the way down to Bethel to worship, so we're going to worship up in Dan as well. Right? That just again shows the amount of sin that was happening in that nation, because they were totally disregarding what God would have for that nation. Right? What is it that God would say? And so they've separated. And again, you've got now the two tribes, if you want to say it that way, or the two nations: the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah. So that leads us kind of to the last discussion point, and man, it's almost 8 o'clock, so perfect timing. Have you ever heard of the lost tribes of Israel? Okay, so this is an interesting concept here, and this is what ends up happening. So the nation of Israel, again, the what we call the northern nation of Israel, is overthrown. And when they're overthrown, what happens to them is they are dispersed. Okay. So the nation comes in, overthrows them, takes them out of Israel, plants other people into the nation of Israel, and takes those Israelites and disperses them. Never to be heard of again. So the tribe of Dan, we don't know. Does that make sense? I mean, are you guys following me? Simon, we don't know. You know, part of them, again, we know that they were assimilated into the tribe of Judah. Okay. We kind of know that piece, but we don't know much more than that. So those other 10 tribes, they disappear kind of off the face of the earth. They get assimilated into all the other nations around them. To this day, we don't know where they went to. There's a lot of myths out there. There's things like they went to North America, right? There's this myth that some of the Native American tribes are actually Jewish tribes. There is a tribe in Ethiopia that they believe is a Jewish tribe, and actually is from the tribe of Dan, right? But again, they don't know. They're not able to track because they're lost and assimilated into their culture. That's why they're called the lost tribes of Israel, those 10 tribes. So if you just kind of play the scenario through your mind, that sin, that moment when they decided that even though Rehoboam was acting a fool, he still was the anointed king of Israel, of all of Israel. At that moment, they decided, no, we're going to be our own nation. We're going to separate from the rightful tribe, which the tribe of rulership was Judah, right? That was what God had said. So out of the tribe of Judah, they separated from that. They created their own places of worship. They fight against Judah. They do all this stuff, right? Ahab comes from that line, right? All the stuff. Their punishment becomes they are lost forever, for eternity, and have now been assimilated into the world. They've lost their identity. Where the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, they're able to go back within their genealogy. They know who they are and where they came from. Frank, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm looking at this and I don't see the Golden Heights. Where did that name come in from? I know it's right off, supposed to be right off of Jerusalem, right off of the capital, but I don't see it on this map.
The mount?
Now the Golden Heights. I don't know. That's the name they use now. I don't see it here at all.
Well, this is back from that time period.
Oh, okay.
So the time period when Israel would have been Israel and Judah was Judah.
In all those places, the rest of them, but I see Jerusalem, Bethlehem.
Yeah, those towns, and again, this is what it would have looked like. Today, it doesn't look like this at all.
Oh, okay.
You got Palestine in there, you know, and again, you don't have Philistia. They're no longer alive. There's no one from the tribe of, or no Philistines, right? So Philistia is totally gone. Again, all these others, if we overlaid a current geographical map, you wouldn't see that.
Okay.
Right. And so they're dispersed like that. Now, the story of Judah is so much different because they are exiled into Babylon, right? They're exiled into this captivity, you know, and this is where we get the story of like Daniel, you know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We get some of these stories that come from that, and then we get into like Ezra and Nehemiah, and they're sent back in Jerusalem, right? Ezra sets up the temple, and Nehemiah rebuilds the wall of Jerusalem. Okay, and they repopulate the what we would consider the nation of Judah with the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin, come back into, even though they were separated from that, they actually come back and repopulate, because what didn't happen with the nation of Israel, it was repopulated by a bunch of different other nations, and they took over. Well, then, like Jerusalem, those areas, even though they had people, they had a lot of what they did is they left a lot of the poor and said, hey, you can now have property. But the poor, again, were people from the tribe of Judah, people from the tribe of Benjamin. So that nation of Judah, even though it wasn't a nation at that point, still had the population of Judah and Benjamin. And then again, when Ezra and Nehemiah comes into story, right, they actually start coming back. The nation of Israel comes back. And that's why, in Jesus's time, by Jesus' time, you got a lot of people there, right? A lot of Jewish people, because they had repopulated and were allowed to go back and become the nation of Judah again, or what we consider now the nation of Israel. Oh. Any other questions? Because again, I kind of hope that helps you as you read First Samuel all the way through Second Chronicles, right? It's there's some great reading plans out there to read like chronologically. So you read part of First Samuel and part of First Chronicles. So you'll see a lot of the same stories, but they'll be in the same time frame. So it'll help you understand, maybe just give you a little bit better understanding. But the key to remember and the key to understand is what we're going to see from not really next week, because we're talking more poetry next week, but the following week when we look at the prophets. Again, what we're talking about, and as you read, obviously, First, Second Kings, First, Second Chronicles specifically, what you're going to see is this change of Israel, one nation, to now there's two nations, and then by Jesus's time, there's really only one nation, the nation of Judah.